The dust-covered stranger emerged from the mountain trail like something out of legend, his massive frame bent under the weight of his injured horse, draped across his shoulders. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had seen many things in their frontier lives, but nothing quite like this bearded giant who carried his wounded companion with the tenderness of a father cradling a child. Sheriff Tom Bradley watched in amazement as the mountain man gently lowered the horse to the ground outside the livery stable, his weathered hands never leaving the animal's side. But it wasn't the man's incredible strength or his obvious devotion to his horse that would shock the town. It was what they discovered when they opened those heavy leather saddlebags. Inside lay evidence that would either mark him as the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories or reveal him as something far more dangerous. What secret had this mysterious mountain man been carrying through the wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Cedar Ridge sat nestled in a valley where the Rocky Mountains cast long shadows across weathered wooden buildings and dusty streets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where the general store doubled as the post office, and where Sheriff Tom Bradley had kept the peace for the better part of 20 years. At 58, Tom had seen his share of drifters, outlaws, and broken men seeking refuge in the anonymity of the frontier. But nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that sweltering afternoon in August of 1874. The stranger stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders straining against a faded buckskin shirt that had seen better days. His beard, streaked with premature gray, hung nearly to his chest, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who had spent too many years staring at horizons. But it was his gentleness with the injured horse that caught everyone's attention. "Easy, girl," the mountain man whispered, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large frame. "We made it. These folks are going to help you." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only veterinarian and one of the few women practicing medicine on the frontier, pushed through the gathering crowd. At 32, she had earned the respect of every rancher and farmer in 3 counties through her skill with animals and her no-nonsense approach to both medicine and life. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the horse and running practiced hands along the animal's flanks. "Found her in Devil's Canyon, about 2 days' ride north," the stranger replied, never taking his eyes off the horse. "Looks like she fell, maybe spooked by something. Left forelegs got a bad break, and she's been favoring her right side." Sarah nodded, her examination confirming the man's assessment. "You carried her all this way. Couldn't leave her to die alone." The simple statement hung in the air, and Sheriff Bradley found himself studying the stranger more carefully. In his experience, men who showed such compassion for animals were rarely the type to cause trouble for humans. Still, something about the situation felt off. The man's clothes were well made beneath the trail dust, his boots were expensive leather, and those saddlebags looked heavy enough to contain more than simple camping supplies. "Name's Tom Bradley," the sheriff said, extending his hand. "I'm the law in Cedar Ridge." The stranger hesitated for just a moment before accepting the handshake. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Ezra Stone. Well, Mr. Stone, Doc Mitchell here will take good care of your horse. Why don't you come by my office later? Like to know who's passing through my town?" Ezra's eyes met the sheriff's, and Tom saw something there that made his lawman's instincts prickle. Not guilt exactly, but the wariness of a man carrying secrets. "I'll be along directly," Ezra said. As the crowd began to disperse, chattering about the unusual arrival, Sheriff Bradley noticed that Ezra had left his saddlebags propped against the livery stable wall. The leather was worn but well maintained, and the bags sagged with considerable weight. When he glanced back at the mountain man, he found Ezra watching him with those careful eyes. "Might want to keep an eye on those bags," Tom suggested. "They'll be safe enough," Ezra replied. "Nothing in there that can't wait." But as Sheriff Bradley walked back toward his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that those innocent-looking saddlebags held secrets that could change everything he thought he knew about the soft-spoken stranger who had carried an injured horse down from the mountains. In his 20 years of law enforcement, Tom Bradley had developed an instinct for trouble, and every fiber of his being was telling him that trouble had just arrived in Cedar Ridge. The question was whether it came in the form of the gentle giant tending to his horse, or whether it was something else entirely, something that Ezra Stone had brought down from the mountains in those heavy leather bags. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Sheriff Bradley retrieved a worn folder from his desk drawer. The folder contained wanted posters from across the territory, descriptions of outlaws and criminals who had escaped justice. He spread them across his desk and began comparing faces and descriptions to the mountain man he had just met. What he would discover in those saddlebags would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, revenge, and the thin line between lawman and outlaw. The sun hung low over the mountains when Ezra Stone finally made his way to Sheriff Bradley's office. He had spent the better part of 2 hours at the livery stable, helping Dr. Mitchell set the horse's leg and ensuring the animal was as comfortable as possible. His weathered hands moved with surprising gentleness as he stroked the mare's neck, whispering words of comfort that seemed to calm both horse and veterinarian. "She's a fighter," Dr. Mitchell had observed, watching Ezra's tender care. "Most horses wouldn't have survived that kind of injury in the wild." "She's got spirit," Ezra agreed. "Reminds me of someone I used to know." There was something in his voice, a note of loss that made Sarah look at him more carefully. But before she could ask, he had straightened up and announced his intention to speak with the sheriff. Now, as Ezra knocked on the frame of the open office door, Sheriff Bradley looked up from his desk, where the wanted posters lay scattered like fallen leaves. "Come in, Mr. Stone. Take a seat." Ezra settled into the chair across from the desk, his large frame making the furniture seem small and delicate. From his shirt pocket, he withdrew a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of handling, and held it between his thick fingers like a talisman. "That's a fine piece of carving," Tom observed. "Made it myself, up in the mountains. Helps me remember what's important when the world gets too heavy." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, studying the man across from him. "Speaking of the mountains, that's quite a story about finding that horse in Devil's Canyon. That's rough country up there. What were you doing so far from any settlement?" Ezra's thumb traced the edges of the wooden cross, his eyes growing distant. "I've been living up there for near on 3 years now. Built myself a cabin, trap some, hunt what I need. It's peaceful country if you know how to read it. 3 years is a long time to live alone. What brought you to the mountains in the first place?" For a moment, Ezra was quiet, the only sound in the office the ticking of the clock on the wall. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Lost my family, Sheriff, wife and little girl. Sometimes a man needs to get away from the world for a while, find some quiet to think things through." Sheriff Bradley felt some of his suspicion ease. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of men who had lost everything and were trying to find a reason to keep going. "I'm sorry for your loss. That must have been hard." "It was, still is, if I'm being honest. But the mountains teach you things, patience, how to listen, how to see what's really there instead of what you expect to see." "And what do you see when you look at this situation, Mr. Stone?" Ezra's eyes met the sheriff's directly. "I see a lawman who's trying to figure out if I'm trouble. I see a town that's had its share of problems with drifters and outlaws. And I see a man who's got questions that need answering." Tom nodded slowly. The mountain man's directness was refreshing after years of dealing with people who talked around the truth. "Those are fair observations. Now about those saddlebags of yours. What about them? They look mighty heavy for a man who's been living off the land." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the wooden cross. "Sheriff, there are things in those bags that need explaining. But I'd like to ask you something first. I'm listening. You ever been in a situation where doing the right thing and following the law weren't exactly the same thing?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Sheriff Bradley's pulse quicken. "I've been wearing a badge for 20 years, Mr. Stone. I've learned that the law isn't always perfect, but it's what we've got to keep civilization from falling apart. And if the law failed you, if it couldn't protect the people you cared about." Tom studied the mountain man's face, seeing something there that made him think of his own worst fears, the nightmares that visited every lawman who wondered what he would do if the system he served proved inadequate when it mattered most. "I suppose that would depend on the circumstances," he said carefully. Ezra nodded and slipped the wooden cross back into his pocket. "Then maybe you'll understand what I'm about to show you." Sheriff Bradley followed Ezra Stone back to the livery stable, his hand resting unconsciously on the grip of his Colt .45. The evening shadows stretched long across the dusty street, and most of the townspeople had retreated to their homes for supper. Deputy Jim Crawford, a lanky young man of 25, emerged from the jail as they passed. "Sheriff, everything all right? Stay close, Jim. Mr. Stone here is going to show us what he's been carrying in those saddlebags." The three men stood in a circle around the heavy leather bags, the weight of anticipation thick as mountain air. Ezra knelt beside the bags, his weathered hands working the leather straps with deliberate care. "Before I open these," he said without looking up, "I want you to know that everything you're about to see came from men who deserved to lose it." He lifted the flap of the first bag, and even in the dim light of the stable, the contents gleamed with unmistakable luster. Gold coins, dozens of them, Spanish pieces that caught and reflected the lamplight like captured stars. Sheriff Bradley's breath caught in his throat. "Sweet Jesus," Deputy Crawford whispered. But it wasn't just the gold that made the lawmen's blood run cold. Mixed in with the coins were pieces of jewelry, a lady's cameo brooch, a man's pocket watch with an engraved inscription, and items that spoke of personal value rather than mere monetary worth. Ezra reached into the second bag and withdrew a blood-stained envelope. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, and addressed in a woman's careful handwriting to Mrs. Catherine Stone, Cedar Creek, Colorado Territory. "That's my wife's name," Ezra said quietly, "Catherine Stone. This letter was being carried by a woman named Margaret Henley when she was killed 3 weeks ago on the Bozeman Trail." Sheriff Bradley took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. The bloodstains told their own story, and he found himself looking at Ezra Stone with new eyes. "How do you know about Margaret Henley?" "Because I've been tracking the men who killed her, the same men who killed my Catherine and my little girl Emma 3 years ago." Deputy Crawford stepped closer, his young face pale in the lamplight. "Sheriff, those gold coins, they match the description from the Billings stagecoach robbery 2 months ago." Ezra nodded grimly. 5 passengers killed, including an elderly minister and a young mother traveling with her baby. The Morrison gang doesn't leave witnesses. Morrison gang? Sheriff Bradley's voice was sharp. He knew that name, had seen it on wanted posters from 3 different territories. Led by a man named Clay Morrison, kills for pleasure as much as profit. They've been working this territory for the better part of a year, moving camp every few weeks, hitting stages and isolated homesteads. From the depths of the second saddlebag, Ezra pulled out more evidence of the gang's crimes. A child's torn dress, small enough to have belonged to a girl no more than 6 or 7 years old. A man's wedding ring with the inscription, "To my beloved William, forever yours, Mary," etched inside the band. A woman's lace handkerchief monogrammed with the initials SP. Each item told a story of lives cut short, of families destroyed, of innocence lost to greed and cruelty. Deputy Crawford turned away, his stomach churning at the implications. "Mr. Stone," Sheriff Bradley said carefully, "are you telling me you've been collecting evidence from crime scenes?" "I'm telling you I've been tracking murderers for 3 years, Sheriff. Following their trail, learning their patterns, gathering proof of what they've done. Every piece in those bags belonged to someone the Morrison gang killed. Why didn't you report this to the law?" Ezra's laugh was bitter. "I tried that 3 years ago when they killed my family. Told the sheriff in Cedar Creek everything I knew. He said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue them across territorial lines. Said these things happen on the frontier and sometimes justice has to wait for more convenient circumstances." The sheriff studied the mountain man's face, seeing in his eyes the cold fury of a man who had watched the system fail when he needed it most. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands." "I decided to make sure that when the time came, there would be enough evidence that no lawman could ignore it or explain it away." Sheriff Bradley looked down at the collection of personal effects, each piece a testament to lives lost and justice delayed. The gold coins alone were worth more than most men saw in a lifetime, but it was the wedding ring and the child's dress that made his hands tremble with anger. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge. By the time Sheriff Bradley and Deputy Crawford had finished examining the contents of Ezra's saddlebags, half the town knew that something significant had been discovered. The other half learned about it over breakfast the next morning, and by noon an angry crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office. Jake Morrison, who owned the largest saloon in town and wielded considerable influence among the working men, stood at the front of the group. At 45, Jake was a thick-set man with a permanent scowl and hands that bore the scars of countless barroom fights. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge 5 years earlier with enough money to buy the saloon outright, though nobody asked too many questions about where that money had come from. "Sheriff Bradley," Jake called out, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "We heard you got an outlaw in your jail. We want to know what you're planning to do about it." Sheriff Bradley stepped out onto the wooden walkway, his badge catching the midday sun. Behind him, Deputy Crawford kept a watchful eye on the crowd, while Ezra Stone sat quietly in a cell, not because he was under arrest, but because it was the safest place for him at the moment. "Now hold on there, Jake. Nobody said anything about outlaws. Come on, Tom. Word is that Mountain Man was carrying stolen goods, gold coins and jewelry from robbery victims. What more do you need?" Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, pushed forward through the crowd. She was a thin woman with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, known throughout the county for her ability to turn suspicion into accepted fact through sheer force of repetition. "Sheriff, my husband says that man had enough gold to buy half the businesses in town. Honest folks don't carry that kind of money unless they've taken it from somebody else. Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but the situation is more complicated than it appears." "Complicated how?" Jake Morrison demanded. "A man shows up with stolen goods, you arrest him. That's how the law works." From the back of the crowd, Dr. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the angry murmur. "Has anyone bothered to ask the man his side of the story?" The crowd turned to look at her, and several men shuffled uncomfortably. Sarah Mitchell commanded respect in Cedar Ridge, not just because of her medical skills, but because she had a reputation for seeing through to the truth of matters when others were content to jump to conclusions. "Doc, with all due respect," Jake said, his tone suggesting anything but respect, "we don't need to hear some sob story from a man who's obviously been robbing and killing folks across the territory. Mr. Morrison, you seem awfully quick to condemn a man you've never spoken to. I've seen enough outlaws to know one when I see one." Sarah pushed through the crowd until she stood face to face with Jake Morrison. "Have you? Because I spent 2 hours yesterday watching that man tend to an injured horse with more gentleness than most people show their own children. That doesn't seem like the behavior of a cold-blooded killer. Animals and people are different, Doc. You're right about that. Animals don't lie, and they don't pretend to be something they're not. If that horse trusts him, maybe we should consider why." From her apron pocket, Sarah pulled out a small piece of fabric, faded blue cotton with tiny white flowers. The material was torn and stained, clearly having seen violence. "This belonged to a little girl," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "I found it among the items in Mr. Stone's saddlebags. But before you all start shouting about evidence of his crimes, maybe you should know that this fabric matches the description of a dress worn by Emma Stone, age 6, when she was murdered 3 years ago in Colorado Territory." The crowd fell silent. Mrs. Patterson's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden quiet. "Emma Stone was Ezra's daughter," Sarah continued. "This piece of her dress was all he had left of her after the Morrison gang finished with his family." Jake Morrison's face had gone pale, and Sheriff Bradley noticed how the saloon owner's hands clenched into fists at the mention of the Morrison gang. "You're saying this man's been collecting evidence?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice much quieter than before. "I'm saying maybe we should listen before we judge," Sarah replied. "Maybe we should consider that a man who's lost everything might have reasons for what he does that go deeper than greed or cruelty." The crowd began to murmur among themselves, the angry energy dissipating into uncertainty and something that might have been shame. That evening, as the crowd finally dispersed and the sun set behind the mountains, Sheriff Bradley sat across from Ezra Stone in the jail cell. The metal bars between them seemed less like a barrier and more like a formality, especially after Dr. Mitchell's revelation about the torn dress fabric. "Mr. Stone, I think it's time you told me the whole story." Ezra reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small, faded daguerreotype in a cracked silver frame. The photograph showed a younger version of himself, clean-shaven and smiling, standing behind a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a little girl with pigtails who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "This was taken in Denver, spring of 1871, Ezra said, his voice soft with memory. "Catherine had insisted we get a family portrait made." Said Emma was growing so fast that we needed to capture the moment before it was gone forever. Sheriff Bradley studied the photograph, seeing in the younger Ezra's face a happiness and contentment that was completely absent from the weathered mountain man sitting before him. Catherine was a schoolteacher when I met her, smartest woman I ever knew, could quote Shakespeare and calculate sums faster than most bank clerks. She saw something in me that I didn't even know was there. What did you do for work back then? I was a deputy marshal in the Colorado Territory. Had been for near on 8 years when I met Catherine. Thought I was pretty good at the job. Thought I understood how justice worked. The irony in Ezra's voice was thick as honey. We had a little house on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, with a garden where Catherine grew vegetables and flowers. Emma loved helping her mama tend the plants. Said she was going to be a farmer when she grew up, grow enough food to feed everyone in the whole territory. Ezra's thumb traced the edge of the photograph, following the outline of his daughter's face. September 15, 1871. I was in Denver, testifying in a court case about some cattle rustlers I'd arrested. Catherine and Emma were supposed to be safe at home. Cedar Creek was a peaceful town, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors at night. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward, dreading what he was about to hear but knowing he needed to hear it. The Morrison gang had been operating in the area for about 6 months, but they usually hit stagecoaches and mining camps. Nobody thought they'd bother with a quiet little town like Cedar Creek. The local sheriff, man named Bill Hawkins, said there wasn't enough of value there to attract their attention. He was wrong, dead wrong. They rode into town just before dawn, hit the bank first, then started going house to house, taking what they wanted. Most folks just handed over their valuables and hoped the gang would move on. But Catherine, Ezra's voice broke slightly. Catherine tried to protect Emma. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken horrors. I found them 2 days later when I got back from Denver. Catherine was in the garden she loved so much, and Emma, he couldn't finish the sentence. Sheriff Hawkins said it was tragic, but these things happened on the frontier. Said the Morrison gang was probably in the next territory by then, and there wasn't much point in pursuing them. Said justice would catch up with them eventually. But you didn't believe that. I believed it for about a week, then I started hearing stories. The Morrison gang wasn't just robbing people, they were killing families for sport, leaving children alive long enough to watch their parents die, taking trophies from their victims. They weren't just outlaws, Sheriff, they were monsters. Ezra set the photograph on the small table beside his cot, positioning it so he could see his family's faces in the lamplight. I turned in my badge 3 weeks after the funeral, told Sheriff Hawkins I was going to track down the Morrison gang and bring them to justice one way or another. He said I was making a mistake, that revenge wasn't the same as justice. What did you tell him? I told him that sometimes a man has to choose between the justice he can get and the justice he deserves, and sometimes those aren't the same thing. Sheriff Bradley stared at the photograph, seeing in those happy faces a life that had been destroyed by men who killed without conscience or consequence. That's when you went to the mountains. That's when I started hunting. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sheriff Bradley's office. Ezra Stone sat across from the lawman's desk, no longer behind bars but still very much under scrutiny. The transformation in the town's attitude had been gradual but noticeable after Dr. Mitchell's revelation about his murdered family. "Sheriff, there's something else you need to understand about the Morrison gang," Ezra said, reaching into his saddlebag and producing an object that made Tom Bradley's blood run cold. The spurs were distinctively crafted, silver with intricate Mexican engravings that spoke of expensive taste and considerable skill. But it wasn't their beauty that caught the sheriff's attention, it was their familiarity. He had seen spurs exactly like these before, in wanted posters that had crossed his desk. "Where did you get those?" "Took them off a dead man named Carlos Mendez, one of Morrison's lieutenants. Found his body at their camp in the Devil's Backbone country, about 40 miles northeast of here. Looked like the gang had a falling out over the division of loot from their last job." Ezra set the spurs on the desk with careful precision. "Mendez was wearing these when he killed a family named Patterson outside of Billings 2 months ago. The local sheriff found tracks at the scene, distinctive marks from these exact spurs." Sheriff Bradley picked up one of the spurs, feeling the weight of the silver and noting the craftsmanship. "You're certain these belong to Mendez?" "Dead certain. I followed the Morrison gang for 6 weeks after the Patterson killings, stayed far enough back that they wouldn't spot me, but close enough to learn their patterns. They're not as careful as they think they are. And you've been doing this for 3 years. 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. Ezra's precision was unsettling in its exactness. I know every member of the gang, their habits, their weaknesses, where they like to camp, how they choose their targets. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. Mr. Stone, what you're describing sounds like you've been conducting a one-man war against the Morrison gang. Not a war, Sheriff, an investigation. I may have turned in my badge, but I didn't forget how to track criminals or gather evidence. Evidence for what? For the day when I found a lawman willing to listen. Someone who understood that justice delayed isn't the same as justice denied. From his coat pocket, Ezra produced a folded piece of paper, worn from handling but still legible. This is a list of every crime I can prove the Morrison gang committed in the past 3 years. Dates, locations, victims' names, descriptions of stolen property, everything a prosecutor would need to build a case. Sheriff Bradley unfolded the paper and whistled low. The list covered both sides of the page in Ezra's careful handwriting, documenting robberies, murders and assaults across 4 territories. 23 separate incidents, Ezra continued. 47 confirmed deaths, not counting the wounded who might have died later, and those are just the crimes I can prove with physical evidence. Physical evidence like what's in your saddlebags. Some of it, but I've got more hidden in my cabin up in the mountains. Documents, weapons, personal effects from victims, even some of the gang's own correspondence that I managed to intercept. Sheriff Bradley felt a chill run down his spine. Mr. Stone, what you're describing is the most comprehensive criminal investigation I've ever heard of. Most lawmen don't have resources to track criminals across territorial lines. Most lawmen have other responsibilities. I don't. For 3 years, bringing down the Morrison gang has been my only purpose, and now... Ezra's eyes grew hard as winter stone. Now they're close, closer than they've ever been to Cedar Ridge. I've been tracking them for 2 weeks, and their trail leads right to this valley. The words hit Sheriff Bradley like a physical blow. You're saying they're coming here. I'm saying they're already here, Sheriff. Clay Morrison and at least 4 of his men rode into this area 3 days ago. They've been scouting the town, learning routines, figuring out which businesses have the most money and which houses have the fewest men to defend them. Sheriff Bradley stood up abruptly, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Because yesterday you thought I was the problem. Today, maybe you'll understand that I'm part of the solution. Sheriff Bradley felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. If Ezra Stone was telling the truth about the Morrison gang being in the area, then Cedar Ridge was sitting on a powder keg that could explode at any moment. Show me, he said grimly. Ezra reached into his coat and withdrew a hand-drawn map, the paper creased and worn from constant folding and unfolding. The cartography was precise, showing not just the terrain around Cedar Ridge, but also marked locations, movement patterns, and what appeared to be a complex network of camps and hideouts. I've been mapping their movements for the past 2 weeks, Ezra explained, spreading the map across Sheriff Bradley's desk. They've got a main camp here, about 8 miles north in the old mining country. Secondary camps here and here, probably for quick escapes if they need them. Sheriff Bradley studied the map with growing alarm. The level of detail was extraordinary, showing not just geographical features, but also notes about guard rotations, supply routes, and what looked like planned attack vectors. How did you gather all this information without being detected? 3 years in the mountains teaches you how to move without being seen. Plus, the Morrison gang is overconfident. They've been operating without serious opposition for so long that they've gotten careless about watching their back trail. The sheriff traced one of the marked routes with his finger. This path leads right to the main road into town. That's their primary approach route. They've been using it to scout Cedar Ridge for the past week. Clay Morrison himself rode down that trail yesterday afternoon, bold as brass, probably counting the buildings and estimating how many men he'd need to control the town. You saw Morrison? Saw him and followed him. He spent 2 hours in town, went into the general store, the bank, even stopped by Jake Morrison's saloon for a drink. Sheriff Bradley's head snapped up. Wait, Morrison? Jake Morrison? Ezra's expression darkened. That struck me as interesting too, Sheriff. Jake Morrison, Clay Morrison. Could be coincidence, but in my experience, coincidences are usually just connections you haven't figured out yet. The implications hit Sheriff Bradley like a punch to the gut. Jake Morrison had been one of the loudest voices calling for Ezra's arrest, had seemed almost desperate to see him locked up or run out of town. "There's more," Ezra continued, pointing to several X marks on the map. "According to my observations, the gang is planning to hit Cedar Ridge tomorrow night. Bank first, then the general store, probably finish up at the saloon. Classic Morrison gang pattern." "How can you be sure?" "Because I've seen them do it before. Same pattern in Elkhorn, same pattern in Silver Creek, same pattern in a dozen other towns. They hit fast, take what they want, kill anyone who resists or might identify them later, then disappear into the mountains." Sheriff Bradley studied the map more carefully, noting the escape routes and defensive positions marked in Ezra's careful handwriting. "This is military-level intelligence, Mr. Stone. I was a deputy marshal for 8 years before I became a grieving father. You learn to think tactically when you're tracking dangerous men. What do you propose we do with this information?" Ezra leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We turn their plan against them, use their confidence and predictability to set a trap they won't see coming. With what resources? I've got 1 deputy and maybe a dozen men in town who know which end of a rifle to point. Sometimes that's enough, if you know what you're doing and you're fighting for something that matters." At that moment, Dr. Sarah Mitchell knocked on the office door, her face grave with concern. "Sheriff, I need to speak with you about something urgent." "Come in, Doc. Mr. Stone and I were just discussing some troubling developments." Sarah entered and closed the door behind her. "It's about Mr. Patterson, the banker. He came to see me this morning, said he was feeling poorly, but while I was examining him, he let slip something that worried me." "What kind of something?" "He said he'd been having trouble sleeping, worrying about whether the bank's security was adequate. Said a man had been asking questions about their procedures, wanting to know about guard schedules and how much money they typically kept on hand." Sheriff Bradley exchanged a meaningful look with Ezra. Did Patterson describe this man? Tall, well-dressed, expensive boots, had a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Said his name was Clay Morrison and claimed to be interested in opening an account. "When was this?" "Yesterday afternoon." The gravity of the situation settled over the 3 of them like a heavy blanket. Sheriff Bradley made his decision with the swift certainty of a man who had been protecting communities for 2 decades. "Mr. Stone, I'm going to need your help. If the Morrison gang hits Cedar Ridge tomorrow night, a lot of innocent people are going to die unless we stop them first." Ezra nodded, having expected this moment for 3 years. "What do you need from me, Sheriff?" "Everything. Your knowledge of their tactics, your intelligence about their movements, and your experience tracking them. We're going to turn your hunt into an official law enforcement operation." Dr. Mitchell looked between the 2 men, understanding that she was witnessing a partnership that could save the town or get them all killed. "What can I do to help?" "Doc, we're going to need someone to coordinate medical supplies and help with communications. This could get messy." From his shirt pocket, Ezra withdrew a small leather pouch about the size of a man's palm, decorated with intricate beadwork in colors that seemed to capture the essence of mountain sunsets. The craftsmanship was distinctly Native American, and the wear patterns suggested it had been handled with reverence for many years. "This might seem strange, Sheriff, but I think you should know that we won't be fighting the Morrison gang alone." Sheriff Bradley examined the medicine pouch, noting the careful attention to detail in every stitch and bead. "This looks like crow work." "It is, given to me by Chief Running Bear of the Mountain Crow Tribe about 18 months ago. I helped them recover some stolen horses that the Morrison gang had taken during a raid on their winter camp." "The Crow helped you track the Morrison gang?" "More than that, they've been keeping watch on gang movements throughout their territory. The Crow have no love for men who kill women and children, regardless of their skin color." Dr. Mitchell touched the medicine pouch gently, recognizing the sacred nature of the object. "This represents an alliance. Chief Running Bear said that any man who fought to protect the innocent was welcome in Crow territory. When I told him about my family, about what the Morrison gang had done, he offered the assistance of his warriors." Sheriff Bradley felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "How many warriors are we talking about?" 12 of their finest fighters, led by a war chief named Stone Wolf. They've been shadowing the Morrison gang for the past week, staying out of sight but ready to move when called upon. And you can call upon them Ezra held up the medicine pouch. "This is more than a gift, Sheriff. It's a communication device. If I burn a specific mixture of herbs at a designated location, the smoke pattern will signal Stone Wolf that it's time to act." The implications were staggering. What had seemed like an impossible task, defending a small frontier town against a notorious gang of killers, suddenly seemed achievable with the addition of 12 Crow warriors, led by an experienced war chief. "There's something else," Ezra continued. "Chief Running Bear has been dealing with white settlers for 40 years. He understands the importance of working within the law when possible. His warriors won't just attack the Morrison gang, they'll help us capture them alive if we can manage it." "Capture them alive?" Dr. Mitchell asked. "After everything they've done. Dead men can't stand trial, Doc. Dead men can't confess to their crimes or lead us to other victims who might still be alive somewhere." Chief Running Bear believes that true justice requires witnesses and testimony, not just vengeance. Sheriff Bradley found himself looking at Ezra Stone with new respect. The mountain man had spent 3 years planning not just for revenge, but for justice in its fullest sense. "Mr. Stone, you've been thinking about this confrontation for a long time. Every day for 3 years, Sheriff. I've considered every possible scenario, every way it could go wrong, every way to minimize casualties among innocent people. And your conclusion?" "My conclusion is that the Morrison gang expects resistance from local law enforcement. They don't expect resistance from someone who knows their tactics better than they do, and they definitely don't expect to find themselves outnumbered by Crow warriors who can move through terrain like ghosts." Dr. Mitchell looked out the window toward the mountains, imagining warriors moving silently through the forest, preparing to help defend a town they had no obligation to protect. Why would Chief Running Bear risk his people for Cedar Ridge? Ezra's answer was simple and profound. Because he believes that good people have a responsibility to stand together against evil, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. As the sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge, Sheriff Bradley called together a small group of men he trusted with his life and the lives of everyone in town. They gathered in the back room of the general store, away from curious eyes and listening ears. Deputy Jim Crawford sat beside store owner Ben Matthews, a steady man of 50 who had served in the Union Army and knew how to handle himself in a fight. Across from them sat rancher Tom Wilson and blacksmith Mike O'Brien, both men with strong backs and stronger nerves. "Gentlemen," Sheriff Bradley began, "what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room until we're ready to act." He explained the situation methodically, watching their faces as the reality of the threat sank in. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ticking of Ben Matthews's wall clock. "Sweet Jesus," Mike O'Brien finally whispered, "the Morrison gang. Here. That's right. And if Mr. Stone is correct, they'll hit us tomorrow night." Ezra stepped forward, carrying a long object wrapped in oiled leather. He set it on the table and unwrapped it carefully, revealing a rifle unlike any the men had ever seen. The weapon was a standard Winchester lever action, but Ezra had modified it extensively during his years in the mountains. The barrel had been shortened for better maneuverability in close quarters, the stock had been carved with grip channels for steadier aim, and the trigger mechanism had been adjusted for a lighter, more precise pull. Most striking were the notches carved into the stock, 17 small marks that told their own grim story. "This is what 3 years of hunting dangerous men teaches you," Ezra said, running his hand along the rifle's length. "Every modification has a purpose. Every change makes the weapon more effective for the kind of fighting we'll be doing." Ben Matthews, who knew firearms better than most, examined the rifle with professional interest. "That's fine work, Mr. Stone. Mind if I ask about those notches? One for each member of the Morrison gang I've tracked down over the years. Some died in fights with other outlaws, some got themselves hanged in other territories. But 17 of Morrison's men won't be riding with him anymore." The number hung in the air like smoke. 17 men, not killed in anger or for revenge, but systematically eliminated through careful planning and patient execution. "How many men does Morrison have left?" Tom Wilson asked. 6, counting Morrison himself, but they're the core group, the survivors who've been with him from the beginning. They're experienced, ruthless, and they won't go down easy. Sheriff Bradley spread Ezra's map on the table, showing the planned defensive positions. "We're going to use their confidence against them, let them think they're attacking a helpless town, then hit them from directions they won't expect." "What about the Crow warriors?" Deputy Crawford asked. They'll be our ace in the hole, positioned here and here. Ezra pointed to locations on the map where they can cut off escape routes and provide covering fire. Mike O'Brien studied the rifle again, noting the careful workmanship and deadly efficiency of the modifications. "Mr. Stone, that's a weapon built for killing." "Yes, it is," Ezra replied without apology. "The Morrison gang doesn't respond to warnings or negotiations. They understand only force, and they respect only superior firepower. But Sheriff Bradley said we want to take them alive if possible. We do, but want and reality aren't always the same thing. If it comes down to their lives or the lives of innocent people in this town, the choice is already made." Ben Matthews leaned back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what they were planning. 6 against 6, plus the Crow warriors. Those are better odds than most towns get when the Morrison gang comes calling. "The difference," Ezra said, "is that most towns are reacting to an attack they didn't see coming. We know they're coming, we know their plan, and we know their weaknesses." "What weaknesses?" Tom Wilson asked. "They're used to terrorizing helpless civilians. They've never faced organized resistance from people who know their tactics. Morrison's gotten comfortable with easy victories, and comfortable men make mistakes." Sheriff Bradley looked around the room at the faces of men who had just volunteered to risk their lives for their community. "Anyone having second thoughts?" "Hell no," Mike O'Brien said, speaking for all of them. "I've got a wife and 3 kids in this town. Morrison gang wants to hurt them. They'll have to go through me first." The other men nodded agreement, and Sheriff Bradley felt a surge of pride in the men he was privileged to call neighbors and friends. The next evening, as shadows began to lengthen across Cedar Ridge, the trap was set. Sheriff Bradley positioned his men according to Ezra's careful plan, each taking cover behind buildings and supply wagons that would provide both protection and clear fields of fire. The town appeared normal to casual observation, but beneath the surface, every element was carefully orchestrated. Deputy Crawford crouched behind the water trough outside the bank, his rifle loaded and his nerves steady despite his youth. Across the street, Ben Matthews and Tom Wilson waited in the shadows of the general store, while Mike O'Brien had positioned himself on the roof of the blacksmith shop, where he could provide covering fire for the entire main street. Dr. Sarah Mitchell waited in her clinic, with medical supplies prepared for the wounded she hoped would never come. Her hands were steady as she arranged bandages and instruments, but her heart raced with the knowledge of what was about to unfold. Ezra Stone lay flat on his belly atop the hotel, his modified rifle trained on the approach route the Morrison gang would use. From his elevated position, he could see the entire length of Main Street and the 3 most likely escape routes. In his pocket, he carried a folded telegram that had arrived that afternoon, its contents known only to Sheriff Bradley. The telegram was addressed to Clay Morrison at Jake Morrison's saloon, sent from someone identified only as Denver Charlie. The message was brief but telling. "Bank shipment arrives tomorrow. Guards reduced as discussed. Payment upon completion." Sheriff Bradley had intercepted the telegram when it arrived at the post office, and the implications were staggering. Jake Morrison wasn't just connected to the gang, he was actively collaborating with them, providing inside information about the town's defenses and the bank's security arrangements. The fake telegram Ezra had composed and sent in response was even briefer. "All clear. Proceed as planned. Guards eliminated." As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and darkness settled over Cedar Ridge, Ezra spotted movement on the northern approach. 6 riders, moving carefully but confidently toward the town. Even in the dim light, he could make out Clay Morrison's distinctive profile, the scar on his face visible when he turned his head. The Morrison gang rode into Cedar Ridge like they owned it, which in their experience they usually did within the first few minutes of arrival. They had hit over 24 towns using the same tactics, and Cedar Ridge looked no different from any of the others. Clay Morrison was a tall man with cold eyes and the kind of casual cruelty that made killing as natural as breathing. He wore expensive clothes and rode a fine horse, the profits of 3 years of robbery and murder evident in every detail of his appearance. His men were cut from the same cloth, hard cases who had chosen the outlaw life because it suited their violent natures. They dismounted in front of the bank, leaving their horses tied to the hitching post, with the careless confidence of men who expected to own the town within minutes. Morrison checked his pocket watch and nodded to his lieutenant, a scarred man named Dutch Keller, who carried a shotgun like other men carried walking sticks. "Remember, boys," Morrison said quietly, "quick and clean, bank first, then the general store. Anyone tries to play hero, put them down permanent." What the Morrison gang didn't know was that Jake Morrison had been found tied up in his own saloon storeroom an hour earlier, the fake telegram having served its purpose perfectly. Sheriff Bradley had confronted him with the evidence of his collaboration, and Jake had confessed everything in exchange for a promise that he wouldn't be shot as a traitor. The plan had worked exactly as Ezra predicted. The gang believed they were walking into a defenseless town where the local law enforcement had been compromised. Instead, they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush where every angle had been calculated and every escape route blocked. As Morrison and his men approached the bank's front door, Ezra could see Crow warriors moving like shadows through the darkness at the edge of town. Stone Wolf and his 11 fighters had taken their assigned positions, cutting off the northern and eastern escape routes while leaving the southern route open, exactly as planned. The false telegram had been more than just bait. It had been a masterpiece of psychological warfare, confirming the gang's expectations while hiding the reality of what awaited them. Morrison reached for the bank's door handle, and Ezra took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would finally be served for his murdered family. The first shot shattered the evening quiet like breaking glass. Sheriff Bradley had given the signal when Clay Morrison reached for the bank door, and Deputy Crawford's rifle spoke from behind the water trough. The bullet took down one of Morrison's men before the gang even realized they were walking into an ambush. Chaos erupted on Cedar Ridge's main street as the Morrison gang scattered for cover, their horses rearing and screaming in panic. Morrison himself dove behind a wagon, his hand instinctively reaching for the ornate pistol he wore at his hip. The weapon was a thing of beauty and horror, pearl-handled with silver inlay work that caught the moonlight, but it wasn't the craftsmanship that made Ezra's blood freeze when he saw it through his rifle scope. It was the recognition. That pistol had belonged to his wife Catherine, a wedding gift from her father that she had treasured beyond its monetary value. Morrison was wearing Catherine's pistol like a trophy, a memento of the woman he had murdered 3 years ago. The sight of it filled Ezra with a rage so pure and cold that his hands steadied completely, his breathing slowed, and the world narrowed to the single point where his crosshairs met Morrison's chest. Dutch Keller, Morrison's lieutenant, raised his shotgun toward Deputy Crawford's position, but Ben Matthews' rifle barked from the general store before he could fire. The outlaw spun and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "It's an ambush," Morrison shouted to his remaining men. "Fall back to the horses." But when they turned toward their mounts, they found their retreat blocked by shadows that materialized into Crow warriors. Stone Wolf and his men had moved like ghosts through the darkness, and now they rose from concealment with bows drawn and arrows nocked. Morrison's eyes went wide as he realized the trap's true scope. This wasn't just local law enforcement making a stand. This was a coordinated military operation designed to capture or kill his entire gang. From his position on the hotel roof, Ezra had a clear shot at Morrison, but something made him hesitate. The pearl-handled pistol gleamed in Morrison's hand, and Ezra found himself remembering Catherine's face when her father had given it to her on their wedding day. She had promised to pass it down to their daughter Emma when she came of age. Ezra Stone. Morrison's voice carried across the street as he spotted the rifle barrel reflecting moonlight from the hotel roof. "I know you're up there, you son of a bitch. Come down and face me like a man." The outlaw leader's words confirmed what Ezra had suspected for 3 years. Morrison remembered the Stone family, remembered their names, remembered the pleasure he had taken in destroying their lives. "You want your woman's gun back," Morrison taunted, holding the pearl-handled pistol high. "Come and take it." Sheriff Bradley shouted orders to his men, trying to coordinate their fire to avoid hitting each other in the crossfire. Mike O'Brien's rifle spoke from the blacksmith shop roof, sending another of Morrison's men diving for cover behind a barrel. But the gang was trapped now, caught between the townsmen's rifles and the Crow warriors' arrows. 2 of Morrison's men lay dead in the street, and Dutch Keller was bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound. The remaining 3 outlaws, including Morrison himself, had taken cover behind whatever they could find, but their position was hopeless. Morrison made a desperate decision. Standing up from behind the wagon, he grabbed a terrified woman who had been running toward safety and pressed the pearl-handled pistol to her head. "Everybody stop shooting, or the woman dies," he screamed. The woman was Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the shooting started. Her eyes were wide with terror as Morrison's arm tightened around her throat. Sheriff Bradley held up his hand, signaling his men to hold their fire. The Crow warriors, understanding the gesture even without sharing the language, lowered their bows but remained ready. "Let her go, Morrison," Sheriff Bradley called out. "Your fight is with us, not with innocent people." "My fight is with whoever gets in my way," Morrison replied. "And right now, this woman is my ticket out of here." From the hotel roof, Ezra could see the pearl-handled pistol pressed against Mrs. Patterson's temple, could see Morrison's finger on the trigger. The sight of his wife's gun being used to threaten another innocent woman was almost more than he could bear. "What do you want?" Sheriff Bradley shouted. "Safe passage out of town, and I want Ezra Stone to come down and face me." Ezra climbed down from the hotel roof with deliberate slowness, his rifle slung across his back and his hands visible. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, but he knew that Mrs. Patterson's life depended on his cooperation. Morrison had proven 3 years ago that he would kill innocent people without hesitation. "That's far enough," Morrison called when Ezra reached the street. "Now we're going to walk out of here nice and peaceful, just me and the lady and you." "Let Mrs. Patterson go," Ezra said, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Your quarrel is with me, not her." "My quarrel is with anyone who gets between me and what I want," Morrison replied, backing toward the horses while keeping the pistol pressed to the woman's head. "And what I want right now is to get out of this town alive." But as Morrison moved, he left a trail of blood drops in the dust behind him. In the confusion of the gunfight, he had taken a bullet in his left shoulder, and the wound was bleeding more heavily than he wanted to admit. Each drop of blood that fell created a clear trail marking his movement, evidence that would be impossible to hide even in darkness. Sheriff Bradley watched from his position near the jail, calculating distances and angles. Morrison was backing toward the horses, but the route would take him past several points where the townsmen could get clear shots. The problem was Mrs. Patterson, whose presence made any aggressive action too dangerous to attempt. Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged from her clinic, her hands raised to show she carried no weapons. "Mr. Morrison, that woman needs medical attention. She's hurt." It was true. Mrs. Patterson had been grazed by a bullet during the initial exchange of gunfire, and blood was seeping through her dress sleeve. The sight of it seemed to enrage Morrison further. "Stay back, Doc, or I'll put a bullet in her head right now. I'm a doctor. Let me help her. The only help she needs is for everyone to let us ride out of here." Morrison's remaining men, Dutch Keller and a hard case named Skinner, were backing toward the horses as well, their weapons trained on the townsmen and Crow warriors who surrounded them. But Dutch was losing blood fast from his shoulder wound, and Skinner kept glancing nervously at the shadows where Stonewolf's warriors waited. As Morrison reached the horses, he made a critical mistake. In his haste to mount while keeping Mrs. Patterson as a shield, he shifted the pearl-handled pistol from her head to point it at Ezra. For just a moment, the woman was no longer directly threatened. That moment was all Stonewolf needed. The Crow war chief's arrow took Morrison in the right thigh, spinning him around and causing him to lose his grip on Mrs. Patterson. She broke free and ran toward Dr. Mitchell, leaving Morrison exposed and wounded. But even wounded, Morrison was dangerous. He raised Catherine's pistol toward Ezra, and the mountain man could see the madness in the outlaw's eyes, the same cold cruelty that had destroyed his family 3 years ago. "This is for your wife and daughter," Morrison snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ezra dove to one side as the pearl-handled pistol roared, the bullet whining past his ear close enough to burn. He rolled behind a water trough and came up with his own weapon drawn, but Morrison was already moving, using his horse as cover while he tried to mount. Dutch Keller made a desperate play, raising his shotgun toward the Crow warriors, but Ben Matthews put a bullet through his chest before he could fire. The outlaw fell backward into the dust, the shotgun clattering away from his lifeless fingers. Skinner threw down his weapons and raised his hands. "I surrender. Don't shoot." But Morrison wasn't finished. Even with an arrow through his leg and blood loss making him weak, he managed to get into the saddle. He wheeled his horse toward the southern escape route, the one path that Sheriff Bradley and Ezra had deliberately left open. "This isn't over, Stone," Morrison shouted as he spurred his horse toward the edge of town. "I'll be back for you." The bloodied bandana Morrison had tied around his wounded shoulder came loose as he rode, fluttering to the ground like a surrender flag. The white cotton cloth was now stained red with his blood, creating a trail that would be easy to follow even in darkness. Ezra picked up the bandana, feeling the wet warmth of Morrison's blood on the fabric. After 3 years of hunting, his quarry was wounded and running, but still dangerous and still free. The pursuit led deep into the mountains as Ezra followed Morrison's blood trail through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with each mile. Sheriff Bradley rode beside him, despite a bullet graze across his ribs, refusing to let the mountain man face Morrison alone after everything they had been through together. The trail wound upward through pine forests and across rocky ledges where one misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into the canyon below. Morrison's blood loss was evident in the increasing frequency of red spots on the rocks and the erratic path his horse was taking. "He's heading for Devil's Canyon," Ezra said, studying the tracks in the moonlight. "Same place where I found the injured horse. He knows that country. Can we catch him before he reaches it? Maybe. But he's desperate now, and desperate men do unpredictable things." They crested a ridge and saw Morrison's horse standing riderless beside a narrow stream. The animal was blowing hard, its flanks covered with sweat and foam. Morrison himself was nowhere to be seen, but the blood trail continued on foot toward a cluster of boulders that formed a natural fortress. "He's gone to ground," Sheriff Bradley observed. "Probably figures to make his last stand in those rocks." Ezra dismounted and checked his rifle, ensuring the action was clear and the ammunition was fresh. 3 years of hunting had led to this moment, this final confrontation with the man who had destroyed his family. "Clay Morrison," he called toward the rocks. "It's over. Come out and face justice." Morrison's voice echoed from the boulders, weak but still defiant. "Justice? You killed my men, burned my camps, hunted me like an animal for 3 years. What kind of justice is that? The kind you earned when you murdered my wife and daughter. Your family was just business, Stone. Nothing personal." The casual dismissal of Catherine and Emma's lives as just business hit Ezra like a physical blow. He had to steady himself against a tree trunk as rage threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking. Sheriff Bradley placed a hand on Ezra's shoulder. "Easy, don't let him get under your skin. That's what he wants." From the rocks came the sound of metal scraping against stone, and Ezra realized Morrison was reloading the pearl-handled pistol. Even wounded and trapped, the outlaw leader wasn't ready to surrender. "You want to know about your precious wife, Stone?" Morrison taunted. "Want to know her last words?" Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle, but he forced himself to remain silent. "She begged, Stone, begged for her life and for that little girl of yours. Promised me anything if I'd just let them live." Sheriff Bradley saw the effect Morrison's words were having on Ezra and stepped forward. "Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and a dozen other charges. Surrender now, and you'll get a fair trial." "Fair trial? Like the fair trial you gave my men back in town. Your men chose to fight. You can choose differently. The only choice I'm making is which one of you dies first." Morrison appeared suddenly at the edge of the rocks, the pearl-handled pistol gleaming in his hand. But his wounded leg gave way as he tried to take aim, and he stumbled, his shot going wide. Ezra saw his chance and took it. His rifle spoke once, the bullet taking Morrison's center mass and spinning him around. The outlaw leader fell backward among the rocks, the pearl-handled pistol flying from his grasp to clatter against the stone. Sheriff Bradley rushed forward with his weapon drawn, but there was no need. Morrison lay on his back among the boulders, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth, and his eyes were beginning to glaze. Ezra approached slowly, his rifle still ready but knowing the fight was over. He knelt beside Morrison and picked up the pearl-handled pistol, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon Catherine's father had given her. On Morrison's left hand, barely visible in the moonlight, was a thin gold band that made Ezra's heart stop. Catherine's wedding ring, the one he had placed on her finger 17 years ago in a small church in Denver. Morrison had been wearing it as a trophy, along with the pistol. "Why?" Ezra asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why did you keep them?" Morrison's lips curved in a final cruel smile. "Souvenirs," he gasped. "Every job needs a souvenir." Those were Clay Morrison's last words. The man who had terrorized the frontier for 3 years died among the rocks of Devil's Canyon, still wearing the wedding ring of a woman he had murdered for sport. The ride back to Cedar Ridge passed in relative silence, both men processing what had just occurred in Devil's Canyon. Sheriff Bradley had helped Ezra search Morrison's body, recovering not just Catherine's wedding ring and pistol, but also a leather portfolio containing documents that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the Mountain Man. As they reached the outskirts of town, Sheriff Bradley finally spoke. "Mr. Stone, there's something we need to discuss before we get back." Ezra looked at him questioningly, still clutching Catherine's recovered belongings. "Those papers we found on Morrison, the Federal Marshal's Commission. It was issued to you, wasn't it?" From Morrison's coat pocket, they had retrieved an official document bearing the seal of the United States Marshal Service. The commission was made out to Deputy Marshal Ezra Stone, dated 1869, and signed by the territorial governor himself. Morrison had apparently taken it as another trophy when he murdered Ezra's family. "I told you I was a deputy marshal in Colorado Territory," Ezra said quietly. "You told me you were a deputy marshal. That commission shows you were a federal marshal with jurisdiction across multiple territories. That's a very different thing." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, the weight of old responsibilities settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "I didn't want anyone to know. Federal marshals have enemies, Sheriff, men who might try to hurt innocent people to get to them." "Is that why Morrison targeted your family?" "Partly. I'd been tracking his gang for 6 months before they hit Cedar Creek. Morrison figured out who I was and decided to send a message to other lawmen who might consider going after him." Sheriff Bradley absorbed this information, understanding now why Ezra's investigation of the Morrison gang had been so thorough and professional. He hadn't just been seeking personal revenge, he had been continuing a federal investigation that began before his family was murdered. "Why didn't you report back to the Marshal Service after the attack?" "Because I knew what they'd tell me. Same thing Sheriff Hawkins told me, that Morrison had crossed territorial lines, that pursuit would require coordination between multiple jurisdictions, that paperwork and politics would slow down justice until it wasn't justice anymore." They rode through the main street of Cedar Ridge, where townspeople were cleaning up the aftermath of the gunfight. Dr. Mitchell was tending to the wounded in her clinic, and several men were removing the bodies of Morrison's gang members. "So you took off your badge and became a hunter instead of a lawman." "I never took off my badge, Sheriff. I just stopped wearing it where people could see it." The implications of this statement hit Sheriff Bradley like a thunderbolt. "You're telling me you've been acting as a federal marshal this entire time?" "I'm telling you that Clay Morrison and his gang were wanted on federal charges in 4 territories. My commission gave me the authority to pursue them wherever they went and use whatever means necessary to bring them to justice, even if those means included working outside local law enforcement. Especially then, federal marshals are appointed specifically to handle cases that cross jurisdictional boundaries or involve crimes too complex for local authorities." Sheriff Bradley felt a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Relief that everything Ezra had done was legal and official. Embarrassment that he had been treating a federal marshal like a suspicious drifter. "Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" "Because I needed to know what kind of lawman you were before I trusted you with federal business. Corrupt sheriffs have helped outlaws escape before." They dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, where Deputy Crawford was waiting with a report on the evening's casualties. 2 of Morrison's men were dead. Dutch Keller was wounded but would survive to stand trial, and Skinner had provided a full confession in exchange for a promise of leniency. "What happens now?" Sheriff Bradley asked. Ezra pulled the Federal Marshal's Commission from his pocket, studying the official seal and his own name written in formal script. The document was stained with Morrison's blood, but the words were still clear and legally binding. "Now I finish my report to the territorial governor and close the Morrison gang case file. 3 years, 47 murder victims, and over $200,000 in stolen property. It'll be one of the longest federal investigations in territorial history." And after that, Ezra looked around Cedar Ridge, seeing for the first time not just a place where he had found allies in his quest for justice, but a community that might become home. "After that, I guess I decide whether Ezra Stone, the federal marshal, has any future, or whether it's time to just be Ezra Stone the man." The next morning brought a sense of peace to Cedar Ridge that the town hadn't felt in months. Word of the Morrison gang's defeat had spread quickly, and townspeople moved about their daily business with the easy confidence of people who no longer feared for their safety. Sheriff Bradley sat across from Ezra in his office, where a new deputy's badge lay on the desk between them. The silver star gleamed in the morning sunlight, representing both an offer and a choice that would determine the direction of Ezra's future. "The territorial governor's telegram arrived this morning," Sheriff Bradley said, tapping a yellow paper beside the badge. "He's officially commending your work in ending the Morrison gang threat. Also says your federal marshal commission can be reactivated any time you want to return to duty." Ezra picked up the deputy's badge, feeling its weight and thinking about what it represented. After 3 years of hunting outlaws alone in the mountains, the idea of working within a community again felt both appealing and terrifying. "What exactly are you offering me, Sheriff? I'm 58 years old, Ezra. Been thinking about retirement for the past 2 years, but I didn't want to leave Cedar Ridge without proper law enforcement. Finding someone with your experience and integrity to take over has been my main concern. You want me to replace you as sheriff, eventually. First, I want you to work as my deputy for 6 months or so, give you time to get to know the community, let them get to know you. By the time I'm ready to step down, you'll be ready to step up." The offer was generous and practical, but Ezra found himself thinking about all the reasons why it might not work. "Sheriff, these people know me as the mysterious mountain man who brought trouble to their door. That's not exactly the foundation for community trust. These people know you as the man who risked his life to save them from the Morrison gang. That's exactly the foundation for community trust." Dr. Sarah Mitchell knocked on the office door, carrying a medical bag and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had spent the night saving lives instead of taking them. "Good morning, gentlemen. I wanted to update you on the casualties from last night." "How bad?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "Mrs. Patterson will be fine, just a graze that needed cleaning and bandaging. Dutch Keller will live to stand trial, though he'll have limited use of that shoulder. And Skinner has been very cooperative in providing information about other Morrison gang crimes." She looked at Ezra with professional interest. "How are you holding up? I know last night couldn't have been easy." "I'm managing, Doc. Thank you for asking. Actually, I had an ulterior motive for stopping by." Sarah pulled a chair closer to the desk and sat down. "Ezra, Cedar Ridge needs a sheriff who understands both law enforcement and the kind of dangers that exist on the frontier. You've proven you can handle both. Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate your confidence, but I'm not sure I'm ready to rejoin civilization just yet. What would it take to make you ready?" The question hung in the air while Ezra considered his answer. For 3 years, his entire purpose had been focused on bringing the Morrison gang to justice. Now that the mission was complete, he felt adrift, uncertain about what came next. "I'd need to know that I could make a real difference here, that the job would be more than just keeping drunks from disturbing the peace and settling disputes between neighbors." Sheriff Bradley leaned forward. "Ezra, the frontier is changing. Towns like Cedar Ridge are growing, attracting new settlers and new businesses. But they're also attracting new types of criminals, men who are smarter and more dangerous than the common outlaws we've dealt with before." "What kind of criminals?" "Land speculators who use violence to force out homesteaders, mining companies that ignore safety regulations and bribe officials, cattle barons who hire gunmen to intimidate smaller ranchers. The kind of problems that require someone with federal law enforcement experience." Dr. Mitchell nodded agreement. "We need someone who can think beyond local jurisdiction, someone who understands how to coordinate with federal authorities when necessary." Ezra picked up the deputy's badge again, turning it over in his palm. The metal was cool and smooth, unmarked by the wear and scratches that came from years of honest service. "If I accepted this position, I'd want some conditions." "Name them." "First, I'd want to continue living in my cabin in the mountains, at least part of the time. I need that connection to the wilderness." "Agreed." "Second, if federal cases arise that require martial authority, I'd want the freedom to reactivate my federal commission. That could actually be helpful. Having a federal marshal available would give Cedar Ridge more law enforcement options." Ezra set the badge back on the desk, but he didn't push it away. 2 weeks later, Ezra Stone knelt in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, his weathered hands carefully placing a young oak sapling into the rich earth. The tree was barely 3 feet tall, its leaves bright green with the promise of spring growth, but Ezra could envision what it would become in the years ahead. "This is for Catherine and Emma," he said softly, speaking to the wind and the mountains, and perhaps to spirits that might be listening. "A living memorial that will grow and provide shade for other families, other children who deserve to grow up safe and free." Dr. Sarah Mitchell approached quietly, carrying a small watering can from the town's garden supply. She had insisted on helping with the planting, understanding the significance of this moment in Ezra's healing process. "Oak trees live for centuries," she observed, kneeling beside him to help firm the soil around the sapling's roots. "Long after we're gone, this tree will still be here, protecting and sheltering people we'll never meet." That's what Catherine would have wanted. She always said the best way to honor the dead was to create something beautiful for the living. They worked in comfortable silence, Ezra's large hands surprisingly gentle as he arranged stones around the base of the tree to protect it from deer and rabbits. The deputy's badge on his shirt caught the afternoon sunlight, still new enough to gleam, but already beginning to feel natural against his chest. His first 2 weeks as Deputy Stone had been relatively quiet, involving more paperwork than gunplay, as he helped Sheriff Bradley process the legal aftermath of the Morrison gang incident. Federal authorities had arrived to collect Skinner and Dutch Keller for transport to territorial prison, and Ezra's detailed reports would serve as evidence in their trials. "Any word from the territorial capital about your federal commission?" Sarah asked. "Governor wants me to keep it active, says there's talk of creating a special task force to deal with organized crime that crosses territorial boundaries. Apparently the Morrison gang wasn't the only group operating like that. Would you be interested in leading such a task force?" Ezra considered the question while he watered the newly planted sapling. "Maybe someday. Right now, I think Cedar Ridge needs my attention more than the territorial government does." The transformation in Ezra over the past 2 weeks had been remarkable to witness. The haunted, solitary mountain man who had arrived carrying an injured horse was gradually being replaced by someone who was learning to be part of a community again. He still spent several nights each week at his mountain cabin, but increasingly he found reasons to stay in town. "The horse is fully recovered," Sarah mentioned. "Doc Peterson says she's ready for light riding if you want to reclaim her. Actually, I was thinking of giving her to the Miller family. Their boy Tommy has been asking about learning to ride, and she's got a gentle temperament. That's generous of you. She saved my life by getting me to Cedar Ridge when I needed to be here. Seems only right that she should have a good home with people who'll appreciate her." They finished planting the tree as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reflected off the cemetery's weathered headstones. Other graves surrounded them, marking the final resting places of pioneers and settlers who had built Cedar Ridge from wilderness. "Ezra," Sarah said as they gathered their tools, "can I ask you something personal? You've earned the right. Do you think Catherine and Emma would approve of the choices you've made?" The 3-year hunt, the violence, the decision to stay here. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the small oak tree that would someday tower over the cemetery. "I think Catherine would understand why I had to hunt Morrison. She was practical about justice, knew that sometimes the law needs help from people willing to do difficult things. And Emma would want me to be happy. She'd want me to find a way to help other children grow up safely, to use what I learned from losing her to protect other families." As they walked back toward town, Sarah noticed how naturally Ezra moved among the buildings and people of Cedar Ridge now. He nodded to shopkeepers sweeping their front steps, tipped his hat to women hanging laundry, and stopped to help an elderly man carry supplies to his wagon. "You're settling in well," she observed. "Settling in? Yes, I suppose I am. For the first time in 3 years, I'm thinking about the future instead of just surviving the present." The oak sapling stood silhouetted against the evening sky, a promise of growth and renewal in a place where death had once seemed like the only certainty. 6 months after the Morrison gang's defeat, Ezra Stone sat at the desk that had once belonged to Sheriff Bradley, watching the morning sun rise over Cedar Ridge through windows that now felt like home. The transition from deputy to sheriff had been seamless, endorsed by a town that had come to respect and trust the man who had risked everything to protect them. On the desk before him lay a piece of paper that had taken him weeks to write, each word carefully chosen and repeatedly revised. The letter was addressed simply to Catherine and Emma, written in the same careful handwriting that had once documented crimes and tracked outlaws across the frontier. "My dearest wife and daughter," the letter began, "it has been 3 years, 6 months, and 12 days since you were taken from me, and not a single day has passed that I haven't thought of you both. I write this letter not because I believe you can read it, but because I need to tell you what has happened to the man you loved and the father you trusted." The letter went on to describe his years in the mountains, his hunt for justice, and his eventual arrival in Cedar Ridge. But more importantly, it spoke of healing, of learning to be part of a community again, and of finding purpose beyond revenge. "Catherine, you always said that the best way to honor those we've lost is to help others find what they need to thrive. I think I'm finally understanding what you meant. Cedar Ridge has given me a chance to protect other families, to prevent other children from experiencing what Emma went through." Through his office window, Ezra could see Dr. Sarah Mitchell walking toward the sheriff's office, carrying the medical bag that had become a familiar sight around town. Their relationship had grown slowly but steadily over the months, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving their community. "Emma, my sweet girl, you would love this town. There are children here who remind me of you, brave and curious and full of hope for the future. I've been teaching some of them to ride, using the gentle mare who brought me here. They laugh the way you used to laugh, and sometimes I can almost hear your voice in theirs." Sarah knocked softly on the doorframe, then entered when Ezra gestured for her to come in. She had seen him working on the letter several times and understood its importance to his continued healing. "How's it coming?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Almost finished. It's harder than I expected, trying to summarize 3 years of pain and growth in a few pages. The important thing is that you're writing it. 6 months ago, you couldn't even talk about Catherine and Emma without retreating into yourself." Ezra nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. "This town has been good for me, Sarah, given me a reason to keep moving forward instead of just surviving. And what about us? Are we good for you too?" The question hung in the air between them, addressing the relationship that had been developing gradually but unmistakably over the past several months. Ezra set down his pen and looked at Sarah directly. "You're the first woman I've been able to care about since Catherine died. That terrifies me and gives me hope at the same time. I understand. I'm not trying to replace what you had with Catherine, Ezra. I just want to be part of what you're building now." He reached across the desk and took her hand, feeling the calluses from medical work and the warmth of someone who had chosen to share his complicated life. "The letter," he said, returning to the pages before him, "ends with a promise. I tell Catherine and Emma that I'll never forget them, but that I'm finally ready to live again instead of just existing, that I've found people worth protecting and a place worth calling home." "And Sheriff Stone," Sarah said with a smile, "what does the future hold for Cedar Ridge's lawman?" "Well, Dr. Mitchell, I suspect it holds whatever challenges the frontier decides to send our way. But for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to facing those challenges instead of just enduring them." Ezra folded the completed letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, though he had no intention of mailing it. Instead, he would take it to the cemetery, where the oak sapling was now firmly established, its roots growing deeper with each passing season. Outside, Cedar Ridge bustled with the activity of a growing frontier town, its people secure in the knowledge that their sheriff was a man who understood both justice and mercy, both the necessity of law and the importance of community. The mountain man who had arrived carrying an injured horse had found something more valuable than the gold in those mysterious saddlebags. He had found his way home,